Today on Uncommon Knowledge, illegal immigration. Is it time to let bygones be bygones?
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, Bienvenidos a los Estados Unidos, or What to Do About Illegal Immigration. There are now some 7 to 10 million illegal immigrants residing in the United States. No one knows the exact number, of course, precisely because they are here illegally. And this despite the fact that in the last 30 years, the Border Patrol has gone from 2,000 personnel and a budget of about $100 million to 11,000 personnel and a budget of some $9 billion. Clearly, what we've been doing has not been working. Now President Bush has proposed a new program under which many illegal aliens would become legal temporary workers. Is the president's plan any good? And if not, what should we try instead? Joining us today, two guests. Mark Krikorian is Executive Director of the Center for Immigration Studies and a frequent contributor to National Review magazine. Tamar Jacoby is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and the editor of Reinventing the Melting Pot, The New Immigrants and What It Means to Be American. Journalist Tony Blankley in the Washington Times, quote, I might agree with the president's proposals for a temporary worker program if they followed a failed national effort to secure our borders. If it was apparent that we simply could not control our borders, then as a practical man, I would try to make the best of a bad situation. But such an effort has not yet been made, close quote. The United States has not yet made a serious effort to control its borders. True or false? Mark?
True.
True. Tamar?
We've been trying for 15 years and it hasn't worked.
All right. That's what we like at the top of a TV show, a nice, sharp disagreement. Let me run down a couple of the principal points in the president's proposal. Foreign nationals would be permitted to work in this country for 3 years at a time. The work permits would be renewable. Before hiring foreign workers, employers, American employers, would have to make a good faith effort to hire Americans first, in effect demonstrating that no Americans wanted the jobs. The program would provide incentives for workers to return home when their work permits expired, such as tax-deferred savings accounts that they could only cash out when they returned to their home country. President Bush called his proposal an expression of, I quote him, common sense and fairness. Is that so, Tamar?
I believe it is.
Well, is it just right?
No, but the president's it's a critical first step in recognizing the reality of the people who come to do jobs in this country that we need done. Rather than pretending they don't come or making them come underground and live in a black market situation that's bad for them and bad for us as a country, the president's saying let's recognize this reality and bring it above board.
Okay, so we have 7 to 10 million, nobody knows the exact number, illegal aliens already here and they're not going back.
Exactly. And people are coming every year. People are coming to fill jobs that we need to get done. And we're pretending they don't come. We're pretending they're invisible.
So the president is coping with reality, Mark?
He's, in fact, basing his proposal, and a lot of people are basing similar proposals, on a bunch of false assumptions that people are going to come no matter what, that these are jobs that Americans won't do, and that we have the administrative capacity, the bureaucratic capacity to actually manage something like this, even if it were a good idea. And none of those things is true.
Okay. Let's take, this is a critical, if indeed it is a premise of the president's proposal, it's certainly a widespread feeling, namely that we just can't control the borders. Tamar, let me quote you to yourself and then ask you to expand. Clearly, the immigration system is broken and enforcement alone, whether on the border or in the heartland, isn't going to fix it, close quote.
We can get control of our borders. I'm not saying there can be no control, but the global labor markets are a reality. We need an enforcement regime, a control regime that's closer to the reality of the situation. What we have now is like prohibition or a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit. That's very hard to enforce. A realistic regime we could enforce and could get control.
Border Patrol, you know the figures. Last 30 years, they go from 2,000 personnel to 11,000, budget of $100 million to $9 billion, and still the the immigrants, illegal immigrants, come?
If you ask Border Patrol agents, even they will tell you that their role is only part of any effort to control immigration. You can't control immigration just through Border Patrol. And that, in fact, is essentially what we've tried to do. And we've given up, for all intents and purposes, stopped enforcement of the immigration law inside the country. And the reason is it's politically more touchy, problematic, whereas the Border Patrol is something that most people in Congress can support without getting a lot of complaints from employers.
But it's politically difficult for a reason. It's because businesses know that they need those workers.
Because
and communities know
Give me a couple
that
of
they
examples.
thrive.
Just roll out 2 or 3 examples of laws already on the books that are going unenforced.
The chief one is the prohibition on hiring illegal immigrants. Before 1986, it was explicitly permitted to hire illegal aliens. In 1986, Congress changed that, and the thinking was to turn off the magnet that attracts illegal immigrants. And part of the deal also was to give amnesty to the people who were already here.
So it made, what was it, about 3 million illegal immigrants, almost 3 million, suddenly became legal.
Right.
So you deal with the people who are already here, and then the other piece was?
Turn off the magnet of jobs by prohibiting their employment. It works. The problem is that you have to enforce the ban on hiring illegals, and we have, even right after it was passed, the enforcement was spotty and episodic, and it has essentially stopped in the past 5 or 6 years because of political complaints.
But because it's a bad law. That would be like having a quota for steel that wasn't enough for the steel we needed.
Tamar has said several times now that America needs immigrant labor. Is this true? I'm going to quote you to yourself again. I hope you find that funny. If we don't create a pipeline big enough to supply the workers we need to fill essential agricultural and service jobs, illegal immigrants will continue to pour into the country to do that work, close quote. But isn't it true that if we cut off the supply of illegal immigrants, essential jobs will still continue to be performed by Americans, but at higher wages?
But why would that be good? It's good for our economy when we can have the wages stay at a level and return to capital and prices go down and the businesses can grow and the whole economy can grow. It's like trade. It's like free trade.
Well,
it works better for everyone when you let supply and demand find its equilibrium.
What I'm trying to understand about your position is this. You've just argued that it's good for our economy to have this large supply of inexpensive labor, and you want to make it legal. But the question is, are you arguing that it's good for the economy or that it's inevitable? That if we wish economic growth, we must have this supply of inexpensive labor. Is that the argument you're making?
I think it'd be very hard to control it. People will come their way. Borders are porous now. But yes, the key point is that it's good for the economy. We could have in the 19th century said no more settlers.
Let me quote Krikorian to himself here.
I am flattered.
Okay. There is simply no economic reason to import foreign workers, close quote. Explain yourself.
And I would actually even go farther than that it's actually harmful to import low-skilled foreign workers. It has a number of effects. One of the main reasons it's different from trade is that immigrants are people too, and immigrants create externalities, which is what the economists use that term. And in this instance, what it means is that immigrants come with all of the vices and virtues and plans and objectives that people have. They're not refrigerators that we can throw away when they're done. And so
immigration is not a special instance of free trade, is what you're saying.
No, it's different in kind from free trade. And even looking simply at dollars and cents, the immigration of low-skilled workers creates more costs in forms of government services, which are not going to be eliminated in a modern society, welfare, education, etc. They create more in cost to the government than they provide in a very small economic benefit by forcing prices down.
Yes, it is. The National Research Council
has said that the economic benefit of immigration, which comes from beggaring the poor by forcing their wages down, amounts to between $1 and $10 billion a year. That's the net figure.
Are you familiar with this study?
Of course.
The fiscal drag from immigration is between $11 and $20 billion a year. So whatever minor economic benefit there is swamped by the extra government.
This is not what the study says. The study says that immigrants pay more in taxes than they take out in services. And they grow the pie of the economy. It's not a zero-sum game. They help us grow the pie. They help businesses grow. They help the economy prosper for everyone.
The only way, the National Research Council, you have to read the footnote. And the footnote is that immigrants do, in fact, on net, pay slightly more in taxes, but not the immigrants. It's the immigrants and their descendants projected out 300 years into the age of Star Trek. And the report itself says that this was an academic exercise that had nothing that would have, it actually said it would be absurd to base policy on this projection.
Okay. Now on to the problem of assimilation, or lack thereof, in recent immigrant groups. Samuel Huntington, esteemed professor of political science at Harvard, has a new piece in Foreign Policy magazine, quote, "Unlike past immigrant groups, Mexicans and other Latinos have not assimilated into mainstream U.S. culture, forming instead their own political and linguistic enclaves from Los Angeles to Miami. The persistent inflow of Hispanic immigrants threatens to divide the United States into two peoples, two cultures, and two languages," close quote. Does this concern you?
Alarmist nonsense. I don't think that's happening.
You don't think it's happening?
I don't think it's happening. Sure, when people first come, they live in enclaves. But Mexican Americans, Hispanics, like every other group in the past, learn English. The kids all know English. By the third generation, 2/3 of them speak only English. They make their way up the socioeconomic ladder. They're not as fast as Taiwanese, but they make their way. They go from being the guy who mows your lawn to being the contractor who hires other people to mow your lawn, and eventually, by the second, third, fourth generation, they're assimilating.
It's a charming and beautiful image that just doesn't exist anymore. This isn't 1910. Our country has changed, and the immigration flow has changed. Our country has changed because the proliferation of multiculturalism, to use a shorthand term, and the loss of self-confidence on the part of our own elite in insisting that people immigrate fundamentally changes the term assimilate. Right. Fundamentally changes the relationship between the immigrant and the home country, and the flow of immigration is different in kind because people from Spanish-speaking Latin America make up the majority of post-1970 immigrants, and that kind of lack of diversity, of concentration in one ethnocultural group has never happened before. Immigration from New York 100 years ago was made up of Italians and Jews and Poles and Germans. They all hated each other. They all spoke different languages. They all had different religions. So they had to find common ground in American culture. That's just not the case today.
In every generation, people say this generation is different and they're not going to fit in. Benjamin Franklin said the Germans don't have an Anglo-Saxon complexion.
Huntington goes through in this very important, I think it's important anyway, this very important article, and draws objective distinctions between immigration from Latin America, most of which is Mexico, that's really what we're talking about here, and all former immigrant groups. Now, so let's take you through a couple of these. No other first world country has such an extensive land frontier with a third world country as the United States has with Mexico. Historian David Kennedy, quoted by Huntington, quote, and 2 points, we've got this long border, quote, "The income gap between the United States and Mexico is the largest between any two contiguous countries in the world," close quote. That is to say that whereas immigration from other countries, in all our previous experience as a nation, was sporadic, it would happen for a period of a decade and a half, then stop. Then begin again, then stop. In Mexico, you've got circumstances which suggest this is just going to keep going for the foreseeable future.
People don't come to be unemployed in America. It's much better to be unemployed in Mexico. It's cheaper, it's warmer, you have family there. They come if there's a job here that they can productively do. They won't come if there aren't jobs for them to productively do.
But Kennedy is saying the income gap is the largest between any two contiguous countries.
Well, that doesn't mean we can employ untold numbers of unskilled people.
But the fact is that immigration from Mexico is different in kind, not only from any immigration that we experienced in the past, but immigration from most of the rest of the world. We have a 2,000-mile border. We have historical baggage that no immigrant group has ever brought to the United States with them before.
Political scientist Peter Scarry, quote, Mexican Americans enjoy a sense of being on their own turf that is not shared by other immigrants, close quote. That is to say, much of the southwestern United States used to be part of Mexico, so they arrived with a political notion of a
there's been no serious Mexican-American revanchist movement in 100 years. A few people on campuses talk about it. It's just not real. I mean, go out in the street. Mexican-Americans are becoming Americans.
Yeah, but the point of this is not that there's that you know, Texas is going to be taken over and secede or something. The point of this is that Mexican immigrants come with an oppositional attitude toward the United States.
Yes,
they do.
It's just
which,
you don't
which
live
simply,
in the world.
which doesn't exist when Germans came to Milwaukee or Jews came to New York. It's not the same thing.
It's just not true. Look at the numbers of people dying in Iraq. Mexican Americans are dying in exact proportion to their share in the population. They serve they're enormously patriotic. They serve in the military. Their values are our values.
Let's discuss one more feature that Samuel Huntington argues makes Latin American immigration unlike any other. Again, he draws the distinction between all previous immigration flows, which tended to disperse relatively quickly. So the Irish land in Boston and New York, and within a couple of decades, they disperse throughout the country. Germans move quickly into the inland. By contrast, says Huntington, you've got large concentrations of Mexicans, legal and illegal, living in the Southwest. He draws also Cubans in Miami. In Miami, he says 75%, quotes figures, 75% of homes speak Spanish as the first language in Miami. So what you've got is heavy enough concentrations that the incentives to assimilate disappear. You can watch Spanish television, you can read Spanish newspaper, you speak Spanish in the home, you get taught in Spanish in the school.
The kids still learn English. Every kid who grows up here is proficient in English. If they don't learn it in school and the schools don't do a good enough job, they learn it from TV. By the third generation, 2/3 speak only English.
And that comes from what? That's Southern California?
That's everybody who studies this. Everybody. This is a universal.
Well, but the fact is, I mean, let's look at a couple of things. Number one, the third generation are the grandchildren of people who immigrated 50 or 75 years ago. Number one. Number two, one third of them.
No.
A mix, both. Mexicans mainly have come illegally traditionally. Number one. Number two, 1/3 of them still speak Spanish. That is actually alarming, quite honestly.
Some Spanish.
Number one. That was number two, rather.
They speak English well. They speak English proficiently. Even in homes where the parents speak mostly Spanish, 85% of the kids speak English well or very well.
Let me push you around a little bit, Mark. Tamar now being purple with bruises. That's not true at all. Tamar can handle herself. 1976, these are round numbers. 1976 to 1996, 2 decades. The 5 counties that make up the Los Angeles, or that touch on and make up the Los Angeles basin, undergo, roughly speaking, a 50% increase in population from about 10 million to about 15 million. You've got an increase of something like 500,000 African Americans, about 1 million Asians, and all the rest Latin Americans, most of them we know from Mexico. And that's just what shows up in the legal records. And there's got to be a large number. What the estimate is about 2 million illegal immigrants. So in other words, now we know, of course, that anywhere in Europe, any kind of population inflow of that proportion would cause a war, right? But look at Southern California, and there are certainly stresses and strains, but the economy has weathered a recession. It continues to grow. The political structure remains intact. In other words, show me the harm.
Southern California has developed along almost third world lines. It's becoming more like Brazil than what Southern California was half a century ago. In
what regards?
There's the Public Policy Institute of California just released a report on the growth of poverty. And the fact is that the gap between rich and poor has increased in California because of immigration. The California's standing with regard to other states, in other words, where its bottom fifth and second bottom fifth of the population stand with regard to the rest of the country, has also fallen because of immigration.
Can I ask you,
we are essentially importing a kind of South Africa or Rhodesia situation where whites are on top and Hispanics
on those
on
two
the bottom.
statistics you quoted, in the old days, every time a boat pulled up to Ellis Island, the average or the income inequality in New York got worse, right? So the mere arrival, what you're doing so far with those statistics is just saying poor immigrants have arrived, right? The question would be, how are they changing the permanent culture? Are they becoming a permanent underclass? Are they failing to assimilate? Do you have measures of that?
Tamar says that immigrants are doing better the longer they're here. There's no question about that.
And you agree with that? That's just the long-term trajectory.
But that's not all you have to look at.
Okay.
We actually have looked at how long-term immigrants have done in each of the past 4 censuses. In other words, those who had been here for between 10 and 20 years.
Just 4 decades you're going back,
when
right?
the census was taken. And the fact is that proportionately they are doing less and less well compared to the rest of the society. They are doing better, but they are not, their situation is not improving as quickly as in the past, and so the gap is growing, and that has political consequences.
Answer that quickly, because I'd like to go to one other point.
In 1960, 50% of Americans didn't graduate from high school. Now only 10% don't graduate from high school. We need people to do those kinds of jobs that those people used to do. And yes, they come from another country. We have the demand, they have the supply,
okay.
And it's good. The places in the 90s that had the highest immigration were the ones that thrived the most economically. Biggest growth, lowest unemployment.
Samuel Hunting.
Last topic, advice for the president.
You're president for a day tomorrow. You can just adopt Bush's proposal. What would you do? Name the correct immigration policy.
Recognize the reality of the global labor market. Instead of having policies that ignore it, that try to stop it, recognize the reality as Bush is doing. The one thing that's wrong with his proposal is it doesn't make enough provision for the people who come here to work to eventually get on a track toward being permanent members of the American society, toward citizenship.
You attack Bush from the left. You're saying his proposal is flawed because it's too hard. You want it to be softer still.
Conservatives also want people to assimilate, and they don't want a caste society. Just a worker program would inevitably bring us to a caste society. That's not what we want. We want people to get on the ladder toward citizenship if they can eventually.
So in other words, the president's policy is taking us towards Saudi Arabia's immigration policy, and I agree.
What is Saudi Arabia's? You've just got
essentially importing people but not permitting them to become members of the society ever. And the fact is, yes, because our immigration model has always been that however many people we take, it's been very large numbers at some points, and it's been very low numbers at other points. But we're only taking them in order to make them into Americans. That should be the exclusive purpose for people being admitted into the United States.
No, I think if some people want to go home, that should be permitted. But they divide themselves.
Something like half of Italians went home. I mean,
yeah, exactly. People go home.
And
some Mexicans will go home.
Get to vote.
And they get to be Americans. And that will get fixed. I mean, Bush is not doing this on his own. This is going to have to go through Congress. Democrats are going to have an input. Republicans can't pass an immigration policy alone. This part will get fixed,
You're
I believe.
president for a day. What do you do?
I reject the idea that there are only 2 choices in addressing this. Amnesty for the illegal immigrants and essentially opening our borders, or, on the other hand, mass roundups and deporting 10 million people on Wednesday. What we need to do instead is to reassert control over our immigration system and through attrition squeeze the illegal population so that instead of increasing every year, it decreases from one year to the next, and we reduce it to a nuisance.
It's not realistic.
You said that after the 86 law is put into effect, it contains provisions for forcing employers to prove that they're not hiring illegals, so on and so forth. And we've never had the political will, except for more than months at a time and here and there, but uniformly and consistently no, to enforce that. Where do you find the political will?
Good question. Practically speaking...
The question from your point of view, right?
Practically speaking, security concerns are going to push us in that direction. But speaking as far as principle goes, sort of ideologically speaking, if we don't have the will for that, tomorrow's policy leads us toward a very different kind of society that people don't want. And my job is to essentially proselytize that we are going toward Brazil and South Africa's model of society rather than what America has traditionally been.
You regard yourself at this stage of the game as a Jeremiah, warning the society that we're headed in the wrong direction.
Yes.
And I regard myself as a realist, saying let's take account of the reality and let's learn how to manage it instead of pretending that the reality isn't happening.
What do you do about assimilation?
I think we do have to talk to people differently about assimilation. We have to help them learn English, help them learn English, not English only, but English first, and more resources devoted, have a norm. We want you to learn, we expect you to learn English, but we're going to also provide some tools. We're going to give you more English classes.
Our assimilationist mechanism has disintegrated since the Cultural Revolution of the 60s, and there is no prospect. Multiculturalism is deeply rooted in every church, every daycare center, every public school, every human resources department. The idea that we can continue to allow 1.5 million immigrants to settle here a year, hopefully hopefully at some point we'll be able to assimilate them is fantasy. We are in fact not doing a good job at assimilation, and we need to fix our assimilation mechanism.
How?
Before we. That's a good
English
question.
only is a.
We need to essentially what we need to do is develop a political consensus that people have to become Americans. Everything will follow from that.
As a political matter, may I just say, as a layman observing the situation, things are drifting her way, not yours. What do you do about? Am I wrong? Are you encouraged by what you see?
Why do Hispanics enlist in the military the way they do? If the failure is so terrible, where does that patriotism come from?
People enlist because of educational benefits, because there are practical advantages to it.
To get a.
Tamar and Mark, I have to wrap it up. 2 predictions. Here's the first one. Will President Bush's temporary worker program ever become law?
No.
Tamar?
In the next couple of years, yes.
All right. Second prediction. In most of Miami today, according to Samuel Huntington, the first language of business and commerce, which is to say, the language that you will hear in Miami, whether you walk into a McDonald's or a law firm, is Spanish.
It's a special case. Miami is a special case.
In 20 years, what will be the first language in Los Angeles? Tomorrow?
It will still be English.
It will.
It will. Miami's a regional hub for Latin America. That's not going to happen to Los Angeles.
Miami is not the wave of anybody's future.
I don't think so.
Mark?
Los Angeles will go a good way toward where Miami is now. It won't be where Miami is in 20 years, but it will move a good deal in that direction. Yes.
Tamar Jacoby, Mark Krikorian, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
I am PBS.